Can I get soup with this? She placed $1.04 on the counter. Coins. All coins. Her fingers trembled, but her eyes did not. The diner went silent, not the polite kind of silence, the kind that happens when something breaks inside a room full of people who didn't expect to feel anything that morning. And in the corner booth, a man covered in tattoos and 30 years of violence slowly set down his coffee cup. He didn't look away. If this story moves you, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm hit northern Wyoming like something personal. It didn't drift in the way winter storms usually do, gradually giving people time to prepare, time to pull coats from closets and stock up on bread and canned goods. This one arrived fast, the way bad news arrives all at once, with no warning and no apology. By 7 in the morning, the highway that connected the small town of Granger's Hollow to the rest of the world had already swallowed 2 trucks and a cattle hauler. The wind was the kind that didn't just cut through clothing, it cut through resolve. It made people question decisions they hadn't even made yet. The Hollow Spoon Diner sat at the edge of Route 12 like a stubborn tooth that refused to be pulled. It had been there since 1971. The sign out front flickered in a way that suggested the letter O had given up on life sometime during the Clinton administration, leaving it to read HLLWSPN on most nights. But the coffee was hot and the heat worked, and on a morning like this one, those 2 things were enough to fill every booth and stool from wall to wall. Truckers who'd pulled over to wait out the storm hunched over plates of eggs. A younger couple sat near the window with a baby in a carrier, their conversation low and tired. A highway patrol officer sat at the counter nursing his second cup, not really reading the newspaper in front of him, mostly just existing in the warmth of the place. 3 booths down from the door, a table of 6 men occupied the back corner, the kind of men who made people reevaluate their seating choices when they walked in. The Hells Angels chapter out of Casper had been riding through when the storm shut the highway down. They were big men, most of them the kind of big that came not from gyms, but from decades of physical labor, hard living, and the specific kind of muscle a man grows when the world has tested him repeatedly and he has refused to fall. Their cuts, the leather vests with patches that announced exactly who they were, hung off the backs of their chairs. Their bikes were parked outside, already half buried under snow. The one they called Reaper sat at the edge of the booth nearest the wall. His real name was Cole, Raymond Cole. He was 62 years old, though he looked older in certain lights and younger in others, depending on whether he was angry or simply quiet. He had a scar that ran from his left ear down to his jawline, a souvenir from Vietnam that he had never once in 40 years explained to anyone who asked. His eyes were dark and steady and gave nothing away. He had been described over the years by prosecutors, by journalists, and by people who feared him as a man without warmth. Those people had never been entirely wrong, but they had never been entirely right either. He was watching the door when she walked in, not because he was expecting anyone. He was watching the door the way a man watches anything when he's been trained by life to always know where the exits are and what's coming through them. It was habit. It was survival. It was the particular alertness of a person who had spent years in places where inattention cost you everything. She was not what he expected. She was small, not frail small, but the kind of small that comes with age when the body begins quietly settling into itself. She wore a coat that had seen better decades, a gray wool thing with 2 buttons missing from the collar and a hem that had been repaired with thread that didn't quite match the original. On her feet were boots that were doing their best against the cold but losing the argument. Her hair was white and fine, and the wind had done something to it on her way in that she didn't bother to fix. She just stood inside the door for a moment, breathing like the simple act of making it that far had cost her something. She didn't look around the room the way most people do when they walk into a crowded place, scanning for familiar faces, checking to see if anyone's watching, performing the casual social inventory humans do instinctively. She just looked forward, at the counter, at the waitress, and she walked toward her. Her name was Margaret Vale. She was 89 years old, and she had $1.04 in her coat pocket, 4 quarters a nickel, and 4 pennies, which was everything she owned until her disability check cleared on Thursday, which was 3 days away, which might as well have been 3 years on a morning like this one. She had walked 6 blocks in the blizzard to get here, not because the diner was the closest warm place, but because it was the only place she thought might let her sit for a while without buying something, and she had told herself firmly in the voice she used when she needed to be hard with herself that she would not ask for charity. She would buy something, she would pay for what she got. That was the rule she had lived by for 89 years, and she had no intention of abandoning it now. The waitress behind the counter was a young woman named Deb, 24 years old. Second shift, 3 months into a job she'd taken to help her mother pay rent after her stepfather left. She had a kind face and the particular kind of tired that only comes from caring too much in a world that doesn't always care back. She looked up when Margaret reached the counter, and she smiled the automatic smile of someone trained to be warm, and then she really looked at the woman in front of her. Something shifted in Deb's face. "Good morning," she said. "What can I get you?" Margaret placed her hand flat on the counter. Then she opened it. The coins were there, a small, quiet, devastating pile of them. "Can I get soup with this?" Margaret asked. Her voice was clear. No trembling in it, no asking for pity, no softening of the question to make it easier for the other person to refuse. It was a direct question asked with the dignity of someone who has never in her life expected the world to simply hand her anything. Deb looked at the coins. She looked at the woman. She opened her mouth and then closed it again. The trucker 2 stools down stopped chewing. The highway patrol officer looked up from his newspaper. The young couple near the window, the one with the baby, the woman reached over and touched her husband's arm without saying anything, just touched it. And in the back corner booth, Reaper Cole set down his coffee cup. Deb leaned toward the register, pulling out the laminated menu from under the counter and turning it so Margaret could see. "The soup of the day is tomato bisque," she said carefully. She hesitated. "It's $3.95 for a cup." "I see," Margaret said. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She looked at the menu for exactly 3 seconds, the way a person looks at something when they're absorbing information they already knew was coming, but had been hoping in some small, quiet corner of their heart might turn out differently. "What can I get for $1.04, she asked. Deb opened her mouth again. Behind her, the door to the kitchen swung open and a man came out, heavy-set mid-50s with a gray mustache and the expression of someone who ran his establishment like a personal kingdom and took violations of that kingdom very personally. His name was Gerald Fitch. He owned the Hollow Spoon. He had owned it for 19 years, and in that time he had developed specific and non-negotiable opinions about things like free meals and the precedents they set. He looked at Margaret. He looked at Deb. He looked at the coins. "What's going on out here?" he said. Deb turned toward him. "This lady was just asking." "I heard what she was asking," Gerald said. He came to stand beside Deb, which was not technically necessary but communicated something anyway, that this was his counter, his diner, his decision. He looked at Margaret with an expression that was not cruel exactly, but was the particular kind of cold that comes from a man who has decided that sentiment is a luxury that ruins businesses. "Lady," he said, "soup's $3.95. That's the price. I don't set different prices for different people." Margaret looked at him. "I understand," she said. "I wasn't asking for a different price. I was asking what I could purchase with $1.04. Gerald blinked. "Coffee's $1.50. A roll is $1.25. You don't got enough for either." A silence moved through the diner like a slow wave. People who had been looking away began to look. People who had been pretending not to listen stopped pretending. Deb turned to her boss. "Gerald?" "Deb." His voice was flat, a period, not a comma. She went quiet. Margaret stood for a moment. Then she did something that Reaper Cole would think about for the rest of his life. She picked up her coins carefully one by one, and she put them back in her pocket. She buttoned the pocket closed. She straightened her coat, and she looked at Gerald Fitch with an expression that contained not a single ounce of anger, not a single ounce of shame, only a kind of exhausted, undefeated dignity that had no words attached to it. "Thank you for your time," she said, and she turned and walked back toward the door. Deb put her hand over her mouth. The trucker, 2 stools down, said something under his breath that rhymes with a word you don't say in polite company. The highway patrol officer stood up halfway from his stool and then sat back down, the social arithmetic of the situation not quite resolving itself into action fast enough. Gerald Fitch went back into the kitchen. Margaret reached the door. She pushed it open. The cold came in like a wall, and for just a moment, everyone in the diner could see what was waiting for her out there. The gray violence of the storm, the empty street, the absolute indifference of a world that had decided long before this morning that it did not owe her anything. The door closed, she was gone, and Reaper Cole was already on his feet, tongue. He didn't say anything to his crew. He didn't explain himself, or ask permission, or do any of the things a man does when he wants the people around him to understand his decision. He just stood up, reached for his cut, and walked toward the door with the particular purposeful quiet of a man who has stopped deliberating and started moving. Boss said the youngest of them, a 26-year-old they called Dagger, who had only been patched in 8 months ago and still hadn't quite learned when to speak and when to shut up. "Stay here," Reaper said. He pushed through the door. The cold hit him like it had been waiting. He pulled his cut tighter, not that it helped much against Wyoming in February, and scanned the street. She wasn't far. Couldn't be. She was 89 years old and the snow was thick, and she had been in there long enough that he saw her, half a block down, moving slow, her head down against the wind. Not hurrying, not dragging herself, just walking with a steadiness that had no business existing in a body that old against a storm that mean. "Hey," he called. She didn't stop. He walked faster. The snow grabbed at his boots. "Hey," he said again louder, and this time she slowed, turned, looked at him. He stopped a few feet from her. Up close, in the full light of the gray morning, she was smaller than she had seemed inside. But her eyes, he registered the eyes immediately, the way he had registered every important thing in his life, fast, involuntarily, with the certainty that what he was seeing mattered. Her eyes were blue and clear and sharp, with the particular quality of someone who had been paying close attention to the world for a very long time. She looked at him without fear. That got him. That was the thing. She looked at 6 feet of tattooed, leather-wearing, scar-faced Hell's Angel, and she didn't flinch. She didn't take a step back. She just looked at him with the same patient, measuring attention she had given the coin on the counter. "Can I help you?" she said. He almost laughed, not because it was funny, because she had turned it around. She was asking if she could help him, standing in a blizzard with $1.04 in her pocket, because apparently that was simply who she was. "You need to come back inside," he said. "I appreciate the concern," she said, "but I'm fine." "You're not fine. It's 12 degrees and you've got nowhere to go." "I have somewhere to go." "Where?" She paused, just long enough for him to know the answer wasn't as solid as the pause that followed it. "Home," she said. "Where's home?" Another pause. "Not far," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The wind moved between them, carrying fine needles of ice that neither of them acknowledged. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "I know that," she said. And the thing was, she seemed to. She seemed utterly unafraid of him in a way that most people, even people who carried weapons, had never managed. "Then come inside," he said. "It's warm. You need to eat something." "I don't accept charity," she said. Flat, non-negotiable. The exact same tone Gerald Fitch had used 2 minutes ago, except on her it sounded like strength instead of cruelty. "It's not charity," he said. "It's breakfast. I'm buying." She looked at him for a long moment. "You don't know me." "No," he said, "I don't." "Then why?" He thought about it. It wasn't a question he'd been asked before, or rather, it wasn't a question he'd ever bothered to answer honestly when asked. Why does a man like Reaper Cole do anything? Why does he get up in the morning? Why does he ride? Why does he stand outside in a blizzard talking to a woman in a worn-out coat? "Because you didn't beg," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but the predecessor of one, the small seismic shift that happens before warmth breaks through. "1 cup of soup," she said. "Whatever you want," he said. "1 cup," she said firmly. "That's all I'm taking." "Yes, ma'am." Dawn. They walked back into the diner together. Every head turned. Reaper didn't acknowledge the stares. He guided her, not touching her, just walking close enough that she would have support if the ground under her feet became unsteady, back toward the corner booth. His crew watched this happen with the careful attention of men who had known Reaper Cole for a long time and could count on one hand the number of times they had seen him do something unexpected. Deb was already moving from behind the counter. She was in front of them before they'd taken 4 steps, and her eyes were wet in the corners, and she said, voice low and urgent, "I tried to get Gerald to let me—" "Bring her the soup," Reaper said. "Put whatever else she wants on my tab." "Of course," Deb said. "Of course, Russ." She turned to Margaret and her voice shifted into something softer. Ma'am, would you like tomato bisque, please? Margaret said. Just the cup. Can I bring you some bread with that? It comes with the soup. Margaret looked at her. Deb nodded almost imperceptibly, a small private signal between them. A woman to woman understanding that the bread did not in fact automatically come with a cup of soup, but that it would today, and neither of them needed to discuss it further. That would be lovely, Margaret said. Thank you, dear. She sat in the booth, across from Reaper. Around them, his crew shifted and rearranged themselves, two of the bigger men moving to an adjacent booth to give the old woman space, a courtesy so instinctive it was almost invisible. The diner slowly returned to something like normal. Not entirely. People were still watching, still listening. The trucker had turned on his stool so that he was facing the room instead of the counter. The highway patrol officer had stopped pretending to read. Reaper wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and watched Margaret Vale settle herself into the booth with the particular careful efficiency of a woman who was accustomed to making do with whatever space was given to her. I'm Cole, he said. Margaret, she said. You live close to here, Margaret. Close enough. In this weather? I've been in worse, she said. And something in the way she said it, simple, factual, unburdened by complaint, made him believe her completely. You got people, he said. Family. She folded her hands on the table. They were the hands of a woman who had worked for a long time, the knuckles large, the skin weathered and thin as paper in the way of very old hands, but still steady, still settled. Not nearby, she said. He nodded, didn't push it. The soup arrived. Deb set it down gently like it was something sacred, which maybe this morning it was. A wide bowl cup technically, but a generous cup of deep red tomato bisque with 2 thick slices of toasted sourdough on the side and a small dish of butter that definitely wasn't on the original order. Margaret looked at it for a moment. This is very kind, she said quietly. To Deb, to Reaper, to the booth and the bread and the small, warm, ordinary miracle of being fed on a cold morning when you have $1.04 to your name and nowhere to sit, in a world that has largely over many decades practiced the art of looking past you. She picked up her spoon. She ate. Around the table, Reaper's crew pretended not to watch. They were not particularly good at it. It was a large man named Hitch, real name Harold, which he had not answered to since 1987, who noticed it first. He was sitting at the edge of the adjacent booth, turned slightly toward the old woman's table in the way of someone who is listening to a conversation they have not been invited into. His eyes moved from Margaret's face to her coat and then stilled. The coat had shifted when she reached for the bread. Just slightly, enough to expose the inside of the left panel. Something was tucked there, folded flat against the lining the way someone carries something they want to keep close and dry and safe. The edge of it was visible, brown and fragile, the corners soft with age. A newspaper clipping, old enough that the paper had gone the color of weak tea, old enough that whatever it said had been read many times and carried for many years. Hitch looked at Reaper. Reaper looked at the coat, then at Margaret. She was eating her soup, watching the window, watching the snow. Reaper picked up his coffee. He did not say anything, but his mind had already started asking the question, the one that once it starts does not stop. Who is this woman really, and why does she carry something like that hidden inside her coat? The bread was nearly gone. The soup was more than half finished. Outside, the storm was deepening, the kind of deepening that signals intention, that says clearly, I am not a passing inconvenience. I am an event. And the highway patrol officer had gotten a call on his radio confirming what everyone already suspected. Route 12 was closed in both directions. Nobody was going anywhere for a while. That announcement moved through the diner in a murmur, and people began the process of resettling, ordering more coffee, claiming booths more permanently, finding the particular mental posture of people who have accepted that they will be stationary for the foreseeable future. Margaret heard it. She set down her spoon. She looked toward the door. Road's closed, Reaper said. I heard. You can't go back out in this. I'll wait for it to ease up, she said. Could be hours. I've waited before. He looked at her. She was still watching the door. Not with anxiety exactly, but with the specific attentiveness of someone who is calculating something, weighing variables, working a problem in a quiet internal way that had no need of an audience. You've got something to get back to, he said. At home, she paused. Winston, she said. Who's Winston? A softening, barely perceptible. But it was there, the first real crack in the composed surface of her, a small warm light through a small opening. "My cat," she said. Something stirred at the table. One of the crew, a younger man, late 20s, with a face that was still learning how to be, as hard as the rest of him, looked down at the table quickly, as if he'd been caught feeling something. "He'll be all right for a few hours," Reaper said. "He's old," she said. "He doesn't like to be alone." "What's he look like?" She looked at him, like she was deciding something. "Gray," she said. "He's gray with one white ear, and he yells at me every morning at 6 o'clock until I give him his breakfast, and then he ignores me for most of the day and acts like I'm his whole world the minute I've been gone too long." The younger man at the adjacent table made a sound that he quickly converted into a cough. Reaper nodded slowly. "Sounds like he's in good hands," he said. She almost smiled. "I don't know whose hands are whose between us." Deb came back to refill Reaper's coffee. She leaned toward Margaret. "Can I bring you anything else? We've got pie, apple and cherry. Gerald's the recipe's good, whatever you think of the man." Margaret looked at the counter for a moment. "Half a slice of apple," she said, "if it's not too much trouble." "Not even a little," Deb said, and walked away with the particular brightness of someone who has found a way to do a small good thing and has decided to do it completely. Reaper watched her go. Then he looked back at Margaret. "Where did you live before here?" he said. "Before Wyoming." She picked up her water glass. "Here," she said. "Born here, born in Laramie, came to Granger's Hollow in 1971. Never left. Long time." "It is," she agreed. "What kept you here?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said simply, "Things you do sometimes keep you somewhere." He didn't push it, not yet. But something in the way she said it, "things you do," settled in his chest like a stone into deep water. Heavy, purposeful, descending slowly into the dark. The pie arrived. She ate it in small, careful bites and looked out at the storm. And somewhere in the back corner of the Hollow Spoon Diner, surrounded by wanted men and weary truckers and one heartbroken waitress and a highway patrol officer who had quietly ordered his fourth cup of coffee because something in him said that whatever was happening in this room was not finished. Happening, Margaret Vale existed. She was 89 years old and she was eating apple pie in a blizzard, and nobody in the room yet knew what she had done or who she really was or why the fact of her small, white-haired, composed unbegging had the entire room holding its breath without quite knowing why. But Hitch knew something was tucked in that coat. And Reaper Cole was the kind of man who, once he starts asking a question, does not stop until he has the answer. And in the inside pocket of a worn gray coat, pressed flat and warm against an 89-year-old chest, a newspaper clipping from 47 years ago, waited as it had always waited to be found. 17 children saved. And beneath that headline, in smaller print, a name that belonged to the woman quietly finishing her apple pie. A name the town of Granger's Hollow had spent 47 years forgetting. Hitch wasn't subtle about it. That had never been his strength. He waited until Margaret excused herself to use the restroom, moving slow steady, one hand briefly touching the edge of the table for balance, and then he leaned across to Reaper's booth and said, voice low, "Boss, she's got something in her coat." Reaper looked at him. "A clipping," Hitch said. "Newspaper. Old. I saw it when she reached for the bread." Reaper said nothing for a moment. Around them, the diner had settled into the particular rhythm of a place where people have accepted. Their trapped, low conversations, the scrape of forks, the radio behind the counter, playing something country and forgettable. Deb was refilling coffees down the row. The highway patrol officer was talking quietly into his phone. "You're not going through her coat," Reaper said. "I'm not saying that," Hitch said. "I'm saying something's there, something she's keeping close." "People keep things close," Reaper said. "Leave it." Hitch sat back, but he didn't stop watching the hallway that led to the restrooms. None of them did. It was Lucas Mercer who spoke next. Ghost had called him that since he was 19, though the reason for it changed depending on who was telling the story. He was 28 now, the youngest full member of the chapter, with a quiet face and the habit of listening more than he talked, which in this group made him unusual enough to be noticed. He'd been sitting at the end of the adjacent booth since they came back inside, not eating, not talking, just watching Margaret with an expression that the others couldn't quite name. "I know her," he said. Everyone looked at him. "Ghost," Reaper said carefully. "You're from Casper." I grew up in Casper, he said, but my mom's from here, Granger's Hollow. She grew up here. He paused. He was looking at his hands now, the way people look at something neutral, when the thing they're actually seeing is internal. She talked about a fire, when she was little, at her school. The booth went quiet. She talked about a woman who ran in, Ghost said, more than once, a lot of times actually. Every time there was a news story about a fire or a rescue, my mom would go quiet for a second and then she'd say, there was a woman when I was 6, she came in for us. And then she'd change the subject. He looked up. She never told me the name, he said. She said she couldn't remember it. I always thought she just didn't want to talk about it. He stopped. That woman's the right age. Reaper looked toward the hallway. You don't know that, he said, but his voice had changed slightly. The way a voice changes when the mind behind it has already started believing something it hasn't finished reasoning through yet. No, Ghost said. I don't know it. Nobody said anything else. Margaret came back from the restroom. She settled herself back into the booth, retied the top button of her coat, and picked up her water glass. She looked around the table at the men watching her and said with a steadiness that suggested she was entirely accustomed to being watched by people who were trying to figure her out. Did I miss something? No, ma'am, Reaper said. She looked at him for one beat longer than necessary. Then she drank her water. How long have you been in Granger's Hollow? Ghost asked. His voice came out slightly different than he intended, tighter, like something in his chest was pressing on it. Margaret turned toward him. She seemed to register something in his face, some specific quality of the question, the way it was held. A long time, she said. Were you here in the 70s? I was. Do you remember? He stopped, started again. Was there a fire at an elementary school? The water glass went back to the table, very gently, very deliberately, the way you set something down when your hands need to be still. Yes, she said, one word, the weight of 47 years in it. Ghost leaned forward slightly. My mother's name is Patricia Mercer. She was born Patricia Howland. She was in first grade when... Patricia, Margaret said. Not a question. Ghost stopped breathing for a second. Little girl, Margaret said, and her voice had changed, had gone somewhere quieter and more interior, the voice of someone reading from a place inside themselves rather than speaking to a room. Front row of the classroom, red beret. She'd lost a tooth that week, and she kept putting her tongue in the gap. A pause. She was the third one I got out. Ghost put both hands flat on the table. He didn't speak. His jaw was working in the way of someone who is fighting the specific physical refusal of emotion that comes when you are a young man raised in a world that taught you that feeling things in public is a form of weakness. He lost the fight. He turned his face away toward the wall and pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, and the sound he made was small and involuntary and entirely human. Hitch looked at the ceiling. Big Harold, who had broken bones and served time and ridden through 40 states without once asking anything from the world, looked at the ceiling and blinked hard. Reaper watched Margaret. She was watching Ghost. And her expression, it wasn't pity. It wasn't the careful compassion of someone performing kindness. It was something rawer than that. Something that looked like grief and relief in the same moment, tangled together so completely they had become indistinguishable. She's all right, Margaret asked. Her voice was barely above a murmur. Patricia, she's good, Ghost managed. He cleared his throat. She's really good. She's in Casper. She's got 3 kids. Margaret closed her eyes, just for a second. When she opened them, they were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the overhead lights. Good, she said. Just that. Good. Deb had appeared at the edge of the booth without anyone noticing when she arrived. She was holding a coffee pot she wasn't pouring from. Her other hand was pressed flat against her sternum. What fire? She said. What are you talking about? Nobody answered for a moment. Then Reaper said quietly, Margaret, tell us what happened. She looked at him, the same measuring look she'd given him outside in the blizzard, the same patient calculation of a woman deciding how much of herself to offer. It was January, she said, 1977. The elementary school on Birch Street. I don't know that it's even standing anymore. It's a parking lot now, Deb said, voice strange and hushed. Margaret nodded like that made a particular kind of sense. The fire started in the boiler room. It moved fast. The building was old. The insulation was wrong. Everything wrong. By the time the fire department got the call, the East Wing was already... She stopped. There were children in the East Wing. 3 classrooms. The firefighters, Reaper said. They were coming, she said. They were 4 minutes away. 4 minutes. She looked at her hands. I was a teacher's aide. I was in the parking lot when it started. I could hear them. The diner was doing that thing again, the thing it had done when she first walked in and laid her coins on the counter. The conversations had stopped. The radio seemed farther away. People who had no connection to this story and no reason to listen were listening anyway, because the human animal, for all its failures, has an instinct for the moment when something true is being spoken. How many times did you go in? Reaper asked. She was quiet. Margaret Ipelum, he said. I stopped counting, she said. After the 3rd time, I stopped counting. How many children? 17, she said. 17? Hitch's chair scraped back an inch. Reaper felt something happen in the architecture of the moment, some internal shift that he recognized from the battlefield, from the moments in his life when the scale of something had exceeded the container he'd prepared for it. You went into a burning building, he said. 17 times. Not 17 times, she said. Some trips I got 2 at once. One on my back, one by the hand. A pause. The smoke was the hardest part. The heat you can push through if you keep moving. But the smoke, she touched her chest just briefly. Just her fingertips against the worn wool of her coat. It took something with it when it left. Your lungs, he said. Lungs, she agreed, and other things. Ghost had turned back to the table. His eyes were red, but his jaw was set, and he was looking at Margaret Vale with an expression that Reaper had never seen on the young man's face before, the particular look of someone who has just understood something about their own life that they had not understood before. The way certain facts, when they land, rearrange everything around them. My mother never told me your name, he said. She said she didn't know it or couldn't remember. That's all right, Margaret said. It's not actually, he said. It's really not. She looked at him carefully. Your mother was 6 years old and her school was on fire. What she remembered is exactly what she needed to remember. She got out. That's what mattered. You mattered, Ghost said. You matter. She smiled at him, then a real one, the first full smile she had offered since walking through the door, and it was a remarkable thing to see on her face because it didn't make her look younger exactly, but it made her look more entirely herself, more fully present, like a window being opened in a room that had been closed too long. You sound like your mother, she said. She told me on the way out she was 6 and the building was coming apart, and she looked up at me and said, Are you an angel? And I told her no, and she said, Yes, you are. I can tell. Margaret's voice softened. 6 years old. Ghost laughed, a wet, broken sound that was more relief than humor. That is so completely her, he said. Oh my God, that is completely her. Hitch laughed too, and the sound of it broke something open in the booth, released some pressure that had been building since Ghost first said the word fire, and suddenly 3 of the largest, most decorated criminals in Wyoming were sitting in a roadside diner, wiping their eyes with paper napkins and trying to pretend they were doing something else. Reaper didn't wipe his eyes, but it was a near thing. He watched Margaret accept the moment, not quite uncomfortable with it, but not fully at ease, either, the way a person looks when they are receiving something they have been told for a very long time they don't deserve. And that was when Deb said it. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. That was clear from the way her hand went to her mouth immediately after, but it came out anyway, the way true things sometimes do when you've been holding them too carefully and your grip finally slips. Why didn't anyone take care of you? She said. The booth went quiet again. A different kind of quiet this time. Not heavy, hollow. Margaret looked at her hands. They did for a while, she said. For about 2 years. There were ceremonies. The mayor gave me something. The school board sent letters. There was a piece in the paper, a few pieces. She paused. But towns move on. That's what towns do. And I wasn't good at being a symbol. She said the word like it had always been slightly too large for her to wear comfortably. I just wanted to go back to being a person. So what happened? Reaper said. I tried, she said. For a long time I tried. She looked out the window at the storm. My fiancé there was a man I was supposed to marry. He was patient for a while, but She stopped, started again more carefully. I wasn't the same after the fire. Not just the lungs. Something in me went somewhere during those minutes inside that building, and it didn't entirely come back. She touched her chest again. He left in 1979. I don't blame him. I was a difficult person to be close to. And after, Reaper said, after, she said, was a long time of smaller things. Work where I could find it. A trailer I bought in 1984 that I have been attempting to keep functional ever since. A dry, brief pause that might have been the point of a joke. Winston arrived in 2019. He helped. No pension, Reaper said, from the school district for what you did. I wasn't an employee, she said simply. I was a teacher's aide on a per-day contract. No benefits. No union. When I got sick, there was nothing to. She stopped. Then, there was nothing. The word landed differently each time. Nothing. As in, no support, no safety net, no recognition that what she had done had cost her the use of her lungs for the rest of her life. No acknowledgement from any official entity that the sacrifice of her health and her future had been worth a single dollar of compensation. Reaper Cole had been angry before. He had been violently, dangerously angry at various points in his 62 years at the government that sent him to Vietnam, at the justice system that had taken 5 years of his life, at 100 smaller injustices inflicted on people he loved. But the anger that moved through him now was a different temperature. Colder, more precise. The kind of anger that doesn't burn fast and loud but sits and hums at a frequency that means it will still be there tomorrow. He looked at Hitch. Something passed between them, the shorthand of men who have ridden together for 20 years. You got Ramos's number on you, Reaper said. The lawyer, Hitch said. He does disability claims, veterans workplace. I know what he does, Hitch said. He was already reaching for his phone. I don't want, Margaret began. I know you don't, Reaper said. We're not asking you. She looked at him steadily. I'm not a charity case. No, he said. You're someone who got robbed. That's different. She opened her mouth, closed it. Something behind her eyes shifted, the slight tilting of a perspective, a recalibration, a woman who has spent so long refusing things that she has confused the refusal itself with strength and is only now beginning to wonder if she had the equation backward. It was at that moment that the door opened. Not the diner's front door, the back office door, the one Gerald Fitch had retreated through 20 minutes earlier and hadn't emerged from since. He came out carrying his coat. He stopped when he saw Margaret was still there, stopped fully, coat half on one arm, through the sleeve, and one arm not. He looked at her, then at the table of bikers around her, then at Deb, who was watching him with an expression that managed to be simultaneously professional and accusatory. Something moved across Gerald's face. He had been in the back room long enough. He had heard enough through the door voices, don't stop at Hollywood, and whatever he'd heard had done something to the internal machinery that usually kept him moving forward without looking sideways. He walked toward the booth. Not fast. The walk of a man who hasn't decided yet exactly what he's going to do, only that he has to do something. He stopped at the edge of the table. Ma'am, he said to Margaret. She looked up at him. The soup, he said, and the pie, he swallowed. It's on the house, both of them. And if you need to stay until the storm breaks, your seat's yours for as long as you need it. He paused. No charge. For anything. Margaret looked at him for a long, steady moment. Thank you, she said. He stopped. Tried again. I didn't know who you were. What You didn't need to know, she said. You needed to have soup for $1.04, that's all. Gerald Fitch stood at the edge of the table with his coat half on, and the rest of him looking like a man who has been handed an assessment of himself that he cannot argue with and isn't sure he deserves to survive. Then he nodded once short, the nod of a man accepting a verdict, and he went back through the door. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Deb sat down in the booth where Hitch and the others had cleared space. She put her elbows on the table. She looked at Margaret with the directness of someone too tired to be oblique. That clipping, she said. The one in your coat. Margaret went very still. I wasn't looking, Deb said quickly. It shifted when I just saw the edge. The headline. Silence. Can I see it? Deb asked. Reaper watched Margaret's hands. They had gone to her coat not to take the clipping out, but to press flat against the pocket, like a reflex, like protection. Nobody pushed. Nobody spoke. The storm pressed against the windows, and the radio played something soft and old, and in the particular held breath of the diner, Margaret Vale slowly opened her coat pocket. She took out the clipping. It was folded into quarters, the creases worn soft with decades of handling. She unfolded it carefully, the way you unfold something that would crumble if you were careless, and she set it flat on the table and smoothed it with the heel of her hand. They all leaned in. The photograph had gone sepia and blurred with age, but you could make out a building. And in front of the building, a woman being carried on a stretcher, her face turned sideways toward the camera. The woman in the photograph was young 30s maybe and unconscious, and her hair was black with soot, and one arm hung loose off the side of the stretcher in a way that communicated total exhaustion of the body, every last resource spent. Above the photograph, the headline, 17 children save local woman pulls children from inferno in heroic act. And beneath it in smaller print, a second line that none of them had expected. One child age 7 still unaccounted for. Search continues. Ghost looked up from the clipping. One child unaccounted for, he said slowly. Margaret's hands were flat on the table on either side of the clipping. I couldn't find him, she said. Her voice had gone somewhere different, somewhere lower and further back. There was a boy. The teacher said there was a boy still in the coat room. I went back in. She stopped. The ceiling came down. The diner was absolutely silent. They told me afterward that he didn't make it, she said. That they found, she stopped again, that he was gone. That it wasn't survivable where he was. She smoothed the clipping again, a gesture that seemed unconscious, like touching a wound you have had long enough that you no longer register doing it. I have carried that for 47 years. Margaret, Reaper said. I went back in, she said. I went back in and I couldn't find him, and the ceiling came down and a firefighter pulled me out, and I woke up in a hospital 3 days later, and they told me. Her voice didn't break. It was somehow worse that it didn't break. They told me he was gone. You believed you failed, Reaper said. I did fail, she said. One child. You saved 17. One, she said. One child. And in those 2 words was the entire architecture of a destroyed life. The fiancé who left the sister, who drifted away, the pension that never came, the trailer that crumbled slowly around her, the cat named Winston, who yelled at her every morning, the $1.04 in her pocket on a Wednesday in February, all of it, every loss and every diminishment, rooted in those 2 words, in that one child, and a guilt so total, it had become indistinguishable from identity. Ghost was looking at her with an expression that had gone past grief into something harder and more purposeful. Margaret, he said, what was the boy's name? She looked at him. Do you remember, he said. Daniel, she said, Daniel Marsh. Ghost picked up his phone, opened near the browser. His hands were steady in the way of someone who has decided to do something and is doing it and will deal with whatever he finds when he finds it. Reaper watched him, didn't stop him. The storm pressed the windows. The radio hummed. Deb sat very still with both hands around her coffee cup, watching Ghost's face, reading it the way you read weather for what's coming, not what's here. Ghost's thumb stopped moving on the screen. His face changed. Ghost, Reaper said. Ghost looked up from the phone. He looked at Margaret. He looked back at the phone. Then he set it very carefully face down on the table, the way you handle something that has just become unexpectedly important. I need to make a call, he said. His voice was strange, tight, and controlled, and alive with something that hadn't been there a minute ago. What did you find? Reaper said. Ghost picked up the phone again, turned it over, slid it slowly across the table until it faced Reaper. On the screen was a page from the Granger's Hollow Public Records Archive. A scanned county document dated March 1977, 2 months after the fire. The header read, Office of the County Superintendent of Schools. Reaper read it once, then again. Then he looked up at Margaret. She was watching his face. Tell me what you're reading, she said quietly. He looked at the page one more time, making sure. Because some things you only want to say once and only when you are certain. Margaret, wait, he said. The boy lived. Margaret didn't move. That was the thing Reaper noticed first. She didn't gasp, didn't reach for the table, didn't do any of the things a person does when the ground shifts beneath them. She sat perfectly still. The way very old things sit still, the way stone sits still, the way something sits still when it has been braced against impact for so long that the bracing has become the posture itself. Say that again, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. but it was steady. God help him, it was steady. The document, Reaper said. He turned the phone to face her and pushed it slowly across the table. March 14th, 1977, County Superintendent's Office. It's a sealed internal memo. She looked at the screen. Her eyes moved across it slowly, then stopped, then moved back to the beginning and read it again the way you read something the second time, when the first time didn't take. When the words arrived at your eyes, but something in the path between your eyes and your understanding refused to let them through. The child was transported, she said, reading aloud now, her voice low and mechanical, the voice of a person in shock doing the one concrete thing available to them. To St. Mary's Regional in Cheyenne, smoke inhalation. Severe, but... She stopped. Survivable. She looked up. Survivable. They knew, Ghost said. His voice was hard, not the performed hardness of a young man trying to sound older than he is, the real kind, the kind that comes from a specific located fury. Someone knew he was alive, and they... Let her read it, Reaper said. Ghost went quiet. Margaret read the rest of it. All of it. Every word of a document that had been sealed in a county records office for 47 years, scanned by some municipal digitization project, filed under a case number that meant nothing until Ghost put Daniel Marsh's name into a search bar and the algorithm did what algorithms do, found the thread, and pulled it. When she finished, she set the phone down. She put both hands in her lap under the table where no one could see what they were doing, and she looked at the wall across the booth, at nothing, at the particular nothing that opens up in front of a person when they are recalculating everything they have ever believed to be true about their own life. They covered it up, Deb said. The words came out with a disbelieving flatness like something dropped from a height. The school district covered it up. The memo references liability, Reaper said. He'd read the document twice while Margaret was reading it once. There was a negligence complaint pending. The boiler had been flagged twice that year, written complaints from 2 teachers about the pressure levels. If it came out that the fire was preventable, they would have lost everything, Hitch said. So they told her the boy died, Ghost said. They told her they let a woman walk away from that hospital thinking she failed, Deb said, thinking she let a child die. And they knew. Someone in that building knew. The words sat in the air of the diner like something with physical weight. Margaret was still looking at the wall. Margaret, Reaper said. She turned to him slowly. I need you to hear what I'm about to say, he said. Not with the part of you that's been living with this for 47 years. With the part that just read that document. She waited. You did not fail, he said. You were lied to by people who were protecting themselves. They took your guilt you had no right to be carrying in the first place, and they used it as cover. They let you disappear into it, and they counted on you never knowing the difference. She stared at him. Her eyes were dry. They were so dry it was almost frightening, like the tear ducts themselves had forgotten the mechanics of the thing after decades of no practice. He's alive, she said. He was alive in March of 1977, Reaper said carefully. This document doesn't tell us. He's alive, she said again. Different this time. Not a question, not even really a statement. Something between a prayer and a declaration spoken in the specific voice of a woman who has decided to believe something because she cannot survive the alternative. Ghost was already back on his phone. Daniel Marsh, he said, searching his thumb, moving fast. Born 1969 or 1970, Granger's Hollow, Wyoming. He waited, scrolled, waited. There's a Daniel R. Marsh registered in Sheridan County. He'd be 55, 56 years old. The booth had gone so quiet that the sound of the phone screen tapping under Ghost's thumb was audible. Licensed contractor, Ghost said. Marsh Building and Restoration, Sheridan, Wyoming. He looked up. He's got a website. Call him Foggy, Margaret said. Everyone looked at her. Margaret, Reaper said. We don't know for certain that this is the same. Call him, she said. There was no arguing with that voice. Reaper had given orders his entire adult life, and he recognized the cadence of one when he heard it. He looked at Ghost. Ghost looked at Reaper. Then he dialed. The phone rang 3 times. 4, 5. Then a man's voice, low, slightly gruff, the voice of someone who spends his days outdoors and answers work calls on autopilot. Marsh Building, this is Dan. Ghost's mouth opened. Nothing came out for a second. "Hello," the man said. Reaper reached across and took the phone from Ghost's hand. Not unkindly, Ghost let him have it. "Mr. Marsh," Reaper said. "My name is Cole. I'm calling from Granger's Hollow. I'm sorry to bother you out of nowhere like this. I need to ask you something, and I need you to bear with me because it's going to sound strange." A pause on the line. "All right. Were you born in Granger's Hollow? Did you attend elementary school here in the mid-70s? A longer pause. "Who is this?" The voice had changed, not hostile, careful. The way a voice gets when it is approaching territory it has mapped before but not often visited. "My name is Cole," Reaper said again. "I'm sitting in a diner in Granger's Hollow in the middle of a blizzard, and I'm sitting across from a woman named Margaret Vale." The line went silent. Not the silence of a disconnection. The silence of a person on the other end of a phone who has just heard a name they were not prepared to hear. Reaper had been in enough significant conversations to know the difference, and this was the latter, the held-breath silence of recognition. "Margaret Vale," the man said, very quietly. "Yes," Reaper said. Another silence. Longer. Is she all right?" Reaper looked at Margaret. She was watching his face, reading the conversation from his side of it, the way the deaf read lips, intent precise, missing nothing. "She's all right," Reaper said. "She's sitting here with us. She's safe." The sound that came through the phone then was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when something they have been holding for a very long time, finally at considerable cost, lets go. "I've thought about her," the man said. "Every year, every single—" He stopped, collected himself. "I tried to find her, twice. Both times I hit dead ends. Someone told me she'd left Wyoming. Someone else said she'd passed away." Reaper closed his eyes for 1 second. "She's here," he said. "She's been here the whole time." Margaret reached across the table. She touched Reaper's wrist, just barely. Just her fingertips, a contact so light it was almost not there. He looked at her. She extended her hand, asking for the phone. He gave it to her. She held it with both hands, pressed it to her ear. "Hello," she said. And from across the table, through the phone, everyone in the booth could hear the voice of a man, a 55-year-old contractor from Sheridan, Wyoming, sitting somewhere in his truck or his office or his life, saying her name. Margaret. Her eyes closed. Her chin dropped slightly. The tight, composed architecture of her face, the structure she had maintained through every moment of this morning, through the coins on the counter and Gerald Fitch's cold arithmetic, and the truth of the document and 47 years of private grief, softened. Not collapsed, softened. The way something very strong softens when it finally finds a surface it can rest against. "You're all right," she said. "I am," he said through the phone. "I really am." "Good," she said. She pressed her lips together. "That's good." Deb had given up entirely on the professional distance that was supposed to exist between a waitress and her customers. She was sitting fully in the booth now, both elbows on the table, one hand over her eyes. Hitch had his arms crossed and was looking somewhere above and to the left of everyone in the specific direction a man looks when he is choosing not to be seen, choosing not to crumble. Ghost was just looking at Margaret, directly, openly, with an expression that had moved past grief into something that looked like there is only one word for it: reverence. And Reaper Cole, who had sat across from prosecutors and soldiers and men who wanted him dead, who had not flinched at things that had ended. Lesser people felt something move behind his sternum that he had not felt in a very long time and could not immediately name. Margaret talked to Daniel Marsh for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. No one timed it. No one would have known to time it except that it was the kind of conversation that leaves a mark on a room, and the rooms it marks tend to remember it. She told him where she was. He told her he would come, that the storm didn't matter, that he had a truck in chains and it didn't matter. She told him to wait until the roads cleared. He said he'd see about that. She laughed, and the sound of it was extraordinary. Not because it was loud or long, but because it was entirely unguarded, entirely unconstructed. The laugh of a woman briefly returned to some version of herself that existed before the weight settled. When she handed the phone back to Ghost, her hands were shaking, not from cold, not from age, from the specific seismic adjustment of a person whose internal architecture has just been fundamentally, irrevocably rearranged. "He's coming," she said. "I heard," Reaper said. She nodded. Then she picked up her water glass. Put it down without drinking. Picked it up again. Margaret, Reaper said carefully, there's something else. She looked at him. The people who sealed that document, he said, the school board, the county officials, in 1977. They're gone, she said. Most of them will be gone by now. The institution isn't gone, he said. The district isn't gone. The legal question. I'm 89 years old, she said. I know. I don't have the energy for a legal. You don't have to have the energy for anything, he said. That's what lawyers are for, and I have a very good one. She looked at him steadily. He could see her working through it, the reflex of refusal, the long-practiced instinct to deflect and diminish and ask for nothing, rubbing up against something newer and more uncomfortable. The slowly forming understanding that what had been done to her was not just personal tragedy, but deliberate harm, and that deliberately inflicted harm was not the same as bad luck and could not be addressed the same way. People should know, Deb said, quietly but firmly in the voice of a woman who has made a decision. People should know what happened to you, what they did. I'm not looking for attention, Margaret said. That's not what I mean, Deb said. I mean there are people in this town who remember the fire, people who remember what you did, and they have been walking past you for years not knowing you were still here, not knowing what happened to you. She paused. That's not just about you, Margaret. That's about all of them, too, the people who were saved. Don't they deserve to know you're still here? Margaret opened her mouth, closed it. It was the first argument she didn't have an answer for. It was also the moment the door opened, the front door of the diner. The cold rushed in ahead of whoever it was, and everyone turned automatically, and the man standing in the doorway was young mid-20s, with a camera bag on his shoulder, and snow in his hair, and the look of someone who had driven through something inadvisable to get somewhere he decided he needed to be. His name was Ryan Shea. He worked for the Granger's Hollow Gazette, which was not so much a newspaper as a community bulletin that had survived into the digital age through stubbornness and a deeply local readership. He'd been on his way to cover a storm-related road closure when his scanner had picked up something, a mention of a Hells Angels chapter stranded at the Hollow Spoon. That was the story he'd come for. He looked around the diner, found the cluster of bikers in the back corner, found the old woman sitting in the middle of them, found Deb's red eyes and Hitch's crossed arms and Ghost's expression, and Reaper's face, which gave nothing away but communicated everything to anyone who knew how to read it. Ryan Shea was young, but he was a reporter. He knew a room in the middle of something when he walked into one. "Hi," he said to the room in general. "Sorry to intrude. I heard there were bikers stranded out here." He paused. Is everything all right?" "Fine," said Reaper. "Sit down," said Deb, which surprised everyone, including her. "Are you from the paper, the Gazette?" "Yeah," he said, approaching carefully. "Ryan Shea." "Sit down, Ryan," Deb said again. "There's something you need to hear." Reaper looked at Margaret. She looked back at him. A question and an answer in the same exchange. She nodded. Barely, but she nodded. And Deb began to tell the story, beginning from the coins on the counter, moving through the blizzard and the booth and the clipping and the phone call. And Ryan Shea pulled out a recorder and set it on the table with hands that were not entirely steady, and the storm pushed its white weight against the windows of the Hollow Spoon, and Margaret Vale sat in the center of all of it still, and contained and present in the specific way of someone who has spent decades hiding and is only now in this strange lost morning, beginning to understand that being found might not be the same as being destroyed. Ryan listened. He didn't interrupt. He was smart enough for that. When Deb finished, he looked at Margaret. "Can I ask you some questions?" he said. "You may," she said. "Why did you stay?" he said. "In Granger's Hollow. If the town forgot you, if there was nothing here, why did you stay?" She considered this longer than she had considered any question all morning. "Because he might still remember," she said finally. "Who?" "Anyone," she said. "Any of them. I stayed because if one of those children ever needed to find me, I needed to be where they could." She paused. "I never stopped thinking someone might look." Ghost made a sound that had no name. Ryan wrote something down, then he looked up. "Mrs. Vale, the document that was found, the county record, if that's authenticated, if what it suggests is verified, we're talking about a serious cover-up by local officials. That's not a human interest story. That's a front page." "It's not a front page story," Margaret said. Ma'am, with respect, it's a conversation I should have had with that boy's family 47 years ago, she said. That's all it is. Everything else is secondary. Ryan looked at Reaper. Reaper said nothing. Not his call. Ryan looked back at Margaret. Can I tell your story? The diner was quiet. Outside, the wind ran itself along the walls. The radio station had gone to static somewhere in the last half hour, and nobody had changed it, and the white noise of it sat underneath the silence the way a river sits under ice present, moving patient. You can tell the truth, Margaret said. If you can find it, the full truth, not just the fire and not just the cover-up. She looked at him steadily. Tell them about the $1.04. Tell them about Winston. Tell them about what happens to a person when the world forgets them and they don't have enough left to buy soup. She paused. Tell that story, because that one is for the people still living it. Ryan Shea, 24 years old, 2 years out of journalism school, 3 months into a job he'd taken because it was the only offer he got, sat in a booth in a roadside diner in Wyoming, in a blizzard, and felt the specific clarifying weight of understanding that the story in front of him was the kind of story that changes what you do and why you do it and who you become. Yes, ma'am, he said. And then because sometimes things happen in clusters the way storms arrive and change everything at once, Reaper's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His jaw tightened slightly. Not alarm. Something more controlled than alarm, but adjacent to it. I have to take this, he said, and he slid out of the booth and walked toward the far end of the counter, and everyone at the table watched him go. And his voice when he answered was too low to hear across the room, and Margaret watched his back and the particular tension in his shoulders and the way his head dipped slightly as he listened to whatever he was being told. He came back to the table 90 seconds later. He stood at the edge of the booth and looked at Margaret. My man in Casper just pulled everything he could find on the 1977 cover-up, he said. Public records, county minutes, school board meeting transcripts. He paused. Margaret, it wasn't just the school board. What do you mean, she said. The memo that sealed the file, he said, the authorization signature. He set his phone on the table again, turned toward her. A different document this time. Older, shakier. It goes up further than the school board. This was signed off at the county commissioner level. Ryan Shea was already writing, which means it was deliberate, Ghost said. It wasn't one scared administrator covering himself. It was a decision made by multiple people in multiple offices who all chose to let her believe a child died, Deb finished. Her voice had gone completely flat. Multiple people. Who could have called the hospital? Who could have made one phone call? Margaret was looking at the document. Names, she said. Are there names? Reaper looked at her steadily. There are names. She looked at the document for a long time. Then there is a story, she said to Ryan Shea. Tell it. And somewhere in Sheridan, Wyoming, a 55-year-old man named Daniel Marsh was looking up road conditions on his phone and calculating how long it would take to drive through a blizzard to a diner on Route 12 where a woman he had never been allowed to thank was waiting in a corner booth drinking tomato soup, and for the first time in 47 years beginning to understand that she had not failed anyone. Reaper sat back down. He picked up his coffee cup. Cold now. He drank it anyway. Then he looked at his crew at Hitch with his arms uncrossed, now at Ghost with his phone, and his mother's face in his features and his jaw set tight with something that had shifted from grief into purpose, and he said quietly enough that only they could hear it. Nobody lets her disappear again. Hitch nodded once. Ghost didn't nod. He just looked at Reaper with an expression that meant the same thing arrived at from a more personal distance. Outside, the storm continued its long, indifferent work. Inside the hollow spoon, something else was beginning. Ryan Shea filed the story at 11:47 in the morning, sitting in the corner booth of the hollow spoon, with his laptop balanced on his knees and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. He filed it to the Gazette's website, first 3,000 words, every document attached as a scan, the county memo reproduced in full, the names of every official who signed it printed clearly and without qualification. He debated with himself for 40 seconds about whether to run the names. Then he thought about Margaret Vale walking back out into the blizzard alone, and he stopped debating. He posted it at 11:47. By noon, it had 400 views, which was 400 more than any story the Gazette had generated in the previous 6 months. By 12:30, it had broken 3,000. By 1 o'clock, Ryan's phone was ringing from a number he didn't recognize, and when he answered it, the voice on the other end was a producer from a regional news affiliate in Cheyenne asking if the documents were verified and whether the woman was available for comment. Ryan looked across the diner at Margaret, who was eating a second piece of apple pie that Deb had brought without being asked, and who was listening to Ghost tell a story about his mother that was making her smile in the careful, wondering way of someone relearning a facial expression they'd thought they'd lost. "She's available," Ryan said into the phone. Then he walked over and asked her quietly whether she was. She looked at him. "What would it involve?" "A phone interview to start. Maybe a camera crew later if the road's clear." I don't need to be on television." "I know," Ryan said. "But Margaret, the document is already out there. The story is already moving. The question now is whether you get to be part of telling it or whether other people tell it for you." She thought about that. The distinction clearly meant something to her, the difference between being the subject of a story and being its author even partially. "All right," she said, "one interview." By 2 in the afternoon, there were 3 more calls. By 2:30, a journalist from the Associated Press had picked up Ryan's piece and filed a National Wire story. By 3 o'clock, the Gazette's website had crashed from traffic volume, which had never happened in the 17-year history of the publication. And the editor, Ryan's boss, a 60-year-old woman named Carol, who ran the paper from her dining room table and had hired Ryan mostly because he was the only applicant, called Ryan's cell phone and said, voice shaking slightly, "Ryan, what did you do?" "I just told the truth," he said. "The AP is calling me," she said. "I know." "CNN is calling me." "I know." "Ryan." "Carol," he said, "just let it run." She went quiet for a moment. "Then is she all right, the woman?" Ryan looked at Margaret, who had finished the pie and was now sitting quietly while Hitch, enormous tattooed Harold who had been to prison twice and had a reputation in 3 states, showed her photographs of his grandchildren on his phone with the particular pride of a man for whom grandchildren had become the organizing principle of his entire existence. "She's better than all right," Ryan said. "I think." The storm began to ease around 2:30. Not dramatically, it didn't stop so much as it stepped back like something reconsidering its position. The wind dropped first, then the snow thinned from a wall to a curtain to something you could see through. The radio found its signal again. Somewhere outside, a plow truck made its first slow pass along Route 12, and the sound of it, that grinding, purposeful scrape of metal against frozen road, reached the diner like an announcement. The highway patrol officer who had been nursing coffee and quietly listening to everything for the past 4 hours got a call confirming that Route 12 would be passable by 3. He put down his phone and looked at Reaper and said, not in his official voice, but in his human one, "Hell of a morning." "Yeah," Reaper said. "That document," the officer said, "the cover-up. You know there'll be a formal investigation." "Good," Reaper said. "The county officials who signed it are dead. Most of them." "The institution isn't," Reaper said. "I believe we covered this." The officer nodded, looked at Margaret, looked back at Reaper. "You're taking care of her situation, the living situation, the medical." "Working on it," Reaper said. "Okay." The officer picked up his hat, paused. She knows what she needs to know," Reaper said. "The rest she'll find out when it's done." This was true. While Margaret had been talking to Ryan and Daniel Marsh and Deb and Ghost and anyone else who found their way to the corner booth, the other half of the table had been conducting a parallel operation with the quiet efficiency of people who are very good at getting things done without drawing attention to the process. Hitch had reached the lawyer Ramos out of Casper and outlined the situation in the flat, factual way of a man who has learned that lawyers respond to facts, not feelings. Ramos had asked for the documents. Ghost emailed them. Ramos called back in 22 minutes and said in a voice that had gone several degrees warmer than his usual professional register, "This is a disability compensation case, a wrongful suppression of information case, and depending on how far we want to push it, potentially a civil rights case. Tell me this woman is alive and mentally competent." Ghost told him. Ramos said, "I'm clearing my afternoon." The crew's youngest member, Dagger, who had been mostly sitting at the counter feeling useless since Reaper told him to stay put, had been given a job around noon. He drove his bike through the tail end of the storm to Margaret's trailer, let himself in through the unlocked door. Nobody locked doors in Granger's Hollow, and found Winston exactly where Margaret said he would be, sitting on the kitchen counter, yelling at the empty room with the full-throated displeasure of a cat who has been waiting too long and wants the universe to know it. Dagger fed him from the bag of food on the counter, checked that the heat was working, it was barely, and texted Reaper a photo of Winston eating that Reaper forwarded to Margaret without comment. When Margaret saw the photo, she pressed her lips together and looked away and said nothing, but her hand that was resting on the table closed very slowly into a fist and then opened again, which was the only sign she gave that the gesture had reached her. It reached her completely. The first car arrived at 3:15. A woman, 50-something, wearing a heavy coat with a hospital badge still clipped to it, she'd driven straight from her shift. She came in through the diner door, looking around the room with the particular urgency of someone who has been in the car for 2 hours telling themselves to drive faster. She saw Margaret in the corner booth and stopped. "Is that her?" she said to Deb, who was nearest the door. Deb looked back. "That depends on who you're looking for." "My name is Susan Holloway," the woman said. Her voice had a quality compressed controlled that Deb recognized from the morning from Ghost's voice when he'd first talked about his mother, from the particular register of someone who is holding an emotion that is too large to carry comfortably. "I was in the second classroom. 1977. I was 5 years old." She stopped. "I'm a surgeon now. I've been a surgeon for 20 years. And she stopped again, put one hand against her sternum. "I need to see her." Deb stepped aside. Susan Holloway walked across the diner to the corner booth, and Margaret looked up, and the two women looked at each other, and Susan said, voice breaking cleanly in half, "You carried me out on your back. You told me to keep my face down. You said, 'Don't look, sweetheart, just hold on.'" She put her hand over her mouth. "I've said that to patients. For 20 years when they're scared, I say that. 'Don't look, just hold on.' I didn't even realize until my therapist pointed it out. Margaret was on her feet. She moved faster than anyone expected, faster than an 89-year-old woman with damaged lungs had any right to move. And she took Susan Holloway's face in both hands, the way a grandmother takes a child's face, and she looked at her and she said, "You became a surgeon." Susan laughed and sobbed at the same time, which produced a sound that had no clean category but was entirely human. "I became a surgeon." "Of course you did," Margaret said. "Of course you did." Reaper looked at Hitch. Hitch looked at the ceiling. The ceiling had been getting a lot of attention from Harold today. More cars came after that. The road was barely passable, and they came anyway. A retired teacher who had been in the parking lot that day and had spent 47 years in the specific guilt of someone who survived something they think they should have stopped. A man in his 60s who said nothing when he came in, just walked to Margaret's table and put an envelope down in front of her and said, "I've been putting $20 aside every month since I was 18 years old. I always thought I'd find a way to give it to you." Margaret looked at the envelope, looked at him, did not touch it. "Please," he said, "please let me." She touched it then. A woman with 2 grown daughters brought photographs, actual printed photographs, the kind that nobody prints anymore, of a young Margaret from the newspaper coverage in 1977. Young Margaret with her black hair and her strong jaw and her eyes that were the same, exactly the same as the eyes watching from the booth right now. She set the photographs on the table, and Margaret picked up one and held it, and the diner did its silent thing again, the thing it had been doing all morning whenever the room needed a moment to absorb what it was witnessing. The highway patrol officer, who was supposed to have left an hour ago, was still at the counter. Not on duty, just there, drinking his 8th cup of coffee and watching the room with the expression of a man who knows he's in the presence of something he'll spend the rest of his life describing to people and never quite capturing. Reaper had been making calls of his own, quieter and more specific. He had a network, 40 years of it, across Wyoming and 3 neighboring states, and he used it the way he used everything, efficiently, without sentimentality toward a specific outcome. The first call was to a contractor he knew in Gillette. "I need a full structural assessment and repair on a residential property. Priority job. I'll send you the address." The contractor, who owed Reaper a favor from 2019 that he had never asked about and never wanted explained, said, when Reaper said, "As soon as the road's clear," the contractor said, "I'll be there tomorrow." The second call was to a woman in Laramie who ran a veterans benefit fund that had over the years expanded its scope to include civilian heroes of certain categories. He explained the situation in 6 sentences. She asked for Margaret's full name and date of birth and social security number. He relayed the request to Margaret through Deb, who relayed it back with the information. By the time he was off the phone, a preliminary application had been filed. The third call was the one that took longest, 15 minutes low and serious by the far end of the counter where nobody was sitting. When he came back to the booth, his expression was no different than usual, closed, watchful, giving nothing away, but something had settled in him that hadn't been there before. A resolved quality. The quality of a man who has found the end of a problem he could work on and worked on it. Ghost noticed. "The sister," he said quietly enough that Margaret couldn't hear. "Oregon," Reaper said. "She's in Portland." Ghost straightened. "You found her." "She found herself," Reaper said. "She's been listed in the public directory for 15 years. Evelyn Castillo Nevale, 76 years old, retired school teacher." He paused. "She has a Facebook account." Ghost stared at him. "You're on Facebook." "Dagger's on Facebook," Reaper said. "He sent her a message." Ghost looked down the counter at Dagger, who was sitting with his phone and doing his best to look like someone who had not just sent a Facebook message to a 76-year-old retired school teacher in Portland at Beaumont. "Did she respond?" Ghost said. Reaper's phone was already in his hand. He looked at the screen. 3 minutes ago, he said. Ghost leaned in to read. Reaper tilted the phone toward him. The message was 4 sentences long. The first sentence said she remembered her sister every single day. The second said she had stopped trying to find her after 2 failed attempts and a decade of guilt. The third sentence said she was looking at flights right now. The fourth sentence said, "Please tell her I never stopped." Ghost read it twice. Then he looked at Reaper and said, "You need to tell her." "I know," Reaper said. "Now." "I know," Reaper said again. He walked to his booth. Margaret was talking to Susan Holloway, who had not left, had claimed a chair at the edge of the table, and shown no intention of leaving it, and to a retired firefighter who had arrived 20 minutes ago and introduced himself as one of the crew who had pulled Margaret out of the building in January of 1977. That conversation had been its own kind of reckoning, a 70-year-old man and an 89-year-old woman looking at each other across 47 years with the specific intimacy of 2 people who shared the worst 4 minutes of their respective lives without ever knowing the other's name. "Margaret," Reaper said. She looked up at him, read his face. "What is it?" she said. He sat down across from her. He set his phone on the table face up with the message from Evelyn visible. She looked at the phone. Her reading glasses were in her coat pocket. She produced them, put them on, looked at the screen with the careful attention she had given every important thing today. The document, the clipping, the photograph. Now this. She read it. Her lips moved slightly on the last sentence. "Please tell her I never stopped." She took her glasses off, folded them, put them back in her pocket. "How did you find her?" she said. "We have our methods," Reaper said. "She's all right. She's in Portland. She's good. She wants to come." Margaret looked at the table, at the photographs of herself from 1977 still spread out there, at the envelope from the man who had been saving $20 a month since he was 18, at the cold cup of coffee that Deb kept replacing and Margaret kept forgetting to drink. "She was 29 when we lost contact," Margaret said. "She had a baby. My nephew, I don't know." She stopped. "His name is Marco," Reaper said. "He's 47. He's a middle school history teacher in Portland. Evelyn has 4 grandchildren. She just retired from teaching 2 years ago." He paused. "She taught 1st grade for 31 years. Margaret looked at him. "1st grade," she said. "Yeah," he said. She understood what that meant. The connection, the particular echo of it, a woman whose sister ran into a burning school full of 1st graders spending her entire career teaching 1st grade, was not something that needed explanation. It explained itself in the way certain things do, with the immediate and devastating clarity of a truth that has been true all along without anyone knowing to look. "She's looking at flights," Reaper said. The storm's clearing. Tomorrow morning, maybe." Margaret sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Tell her yes." Reaper picked up his phone, typed 5 words, sent them, put the phone back in his pocket. The diner had transformed during the afternoon into something that defied easy naming. Gerald Fitch had long ago stopped pretending it was a normal operating day and had simply opened everything, every pot, every tray, every warming shelf, and told Deb to serve whatever anyone needed on the house and to keep the coffee coming until he ran out of the grounds to make it. He was in the kitchen now, cooking with the sustained head-down focus of a man performing an act of atonement that he had not put a name to and did not intend to. The diner was full, not just with the people who had arrived to find Margaret, but with the people who had been here all along, the truckers who hadn't left when the roads opened because something in them said the road would still be there later, and this would not, the young couple with the baby who had moved to a larger table to make room and stayed to hear everything, the highway patrol officer who was still on his ninth coffee and not going anywhere. A military officer arrived at 4:15. Not in uniform, but carrying himself in the way that uniform never entirely leaves a person. He introduced himself as Major Allen Park, retired United States Army. He said he had seen Ryan's article shared in a veterans group online. He said he had driven from Rawlins, which was 90 miles on roads that were technically still not fully cleared. He sat down across from Margaret, and he reached into his jacket and produced something, a small, folded piece of paper encased in a plastic sleeve to protect it. He set it on the table in front of her. Inside the plastic sleeve, she could see it was a newspaper clipping. Her newspaper clipping, a copy of it. Not the original was still in her coat, but a copy that had been laminated and cut and folded and carried until the plastic was worn soft with handling. I carried this in every deployment, he said, twice to Iraq, once to Afghanistan. When I needed to remember that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things, I looked at this. He paused. You saved 17 children. I commanded a unit of 31 soldiers, and I brought home 31 soldiers, and every time it got hard, I thought about you going back in. He stopped. His jaw worked. I never thought I'd sit across from you. Margaret looked at the laminated copy of her own face, younger Sooty unconscious on a stretcher, one arm hanging loose, and was quiet for a long time. Then she looked at Major Park and said, How are your soldiers? He blinked. Ma'am. You're 31, she said. Are they all right? He looked at her at the precise quality of the question, the genuineness of it, the way she had immediately redirected the conversation from herself to the people whose safety had been his responsibility. Most of them, he said, most of them are all right. Good, she said. That's everything. That's the whole thing right there. He nodded. He couldn't speak for a moment, and he didn't try to. Reaper watched this from the other side of the table, and he understood something about Margaret Vale that he had been understanding slowly all day in pieces, the way you understand a landscape from the inside of it, that her refusal to accept recognition was not false modesty. It was not performance. It was the entirely consistent expression of a person who had genuinely never understood herself to be the point. The children were the point. The soldiers were the point. The 31 men who came home were the point. The people she had saved and the people they had saved and the people those people would save. That was the whole architecture, and she was simply, the moment it started, the first domino, the original act from which everything else extended. The problem was that dominoes don't take care of themselves. Ghost pulled Reaper aside around 5 o'clock while Margaret was occupied with a conversation that now included 6 people simultaneously and showed no sign of contracting. Ramos called back, Ghost said, and he's talked to a disability benefits attorney. Margaret's medical situation, the lung damage, qualifies as a service-related injury under a specific provision for civilian heroes. There's a federal program. Small, underfunded, most people don't know it exists. She's been eligible since 1978. Ghost paused. 47 years of back payments is not something the program can cover. But going forward, what's the monthly figure, Reaper said. Ghost told him. Reaper said nothing for a moment. It was not a large number by most measures. But for a woman living on $1.04 and a disability check that cleared on Thursdays, it was the difference between choosing between heat and food and choosing neither. The trailer, Reaper said. Tommy from Gillette is going out there tomorrow, Ghost said. I already talked to him. He's bringing 2 guys. He said 6 weeks, maybe 8, to make it structurally sound and winterized properly. He said, Ghost paused. He said he doesn't want money for it. I told him that wasn't. Let him do it, Reaper said. Ghost nodded. Then there's one more thing. Reaper waited. The trust fund, Ghost said. I put it up this afternoon. Dagger did the technical part. He's better with that stuff. It's been live for 2 hours. He held up his phone, showed Reaper the screen. Reaper looked at the number. He looked at it for a moment. 2 hours, he said. Ryan shared it in the article, Ghost said, and then it got picked up when the AP story ran. Reaper handed the phone back. He looked across the diner at Margaret Vale, 89 years old, sitting in a corner booth surrounded by people who had driven through a storm to find her holding a laminated copy of a newspaper clipping that a soldier had carried to war, listening to a surgeon talk about the words she said to frighten patients. Does she know about the fund? He said. Not yet, Ghost said. Don't tell her tonight, Reaper said. Let her have tonight. Ghost looked at him. Tomorrow, Reaper said. When her sister gets here, tell her then. Let her have someone beside her when she finds out. Ghost put his phone in his pocket. He looked at the room, at the gathering that had grown and deepened over the course of a single storm-trapped day, at the table that had started as a corner booth with 6 bikers and an old woman and a bowl of soup, and had become something that had no clean name, but felt unmistakably like a community in the process of remembering itself. She doesn't know how to take any of this in, Ghost said. She keeps deflecting, keeps turning it back to other people. I know, Reaper said. How do you help someone accept love when they've forgotten how? Reaper looked at him, then at Margaret, then back at Ghost, and he said something that surprised them both by being true. You just stay, he said. You stay until they believe you're not leaving. And outside, the last of the storm was moving east, and Route 12 was open, and somewhere over the mountains, a flight was being booked by a 76-year-old retired school teacher in Portland who had spent 47 years missing her sister. And in Sheridan, Wyoming, a man named Daniel Marsh had already started his truck. Daniel Marsh arrived at 7:43 in the evening. He didn't call ahead to say he was close. He just appeared at the door of the Hollow Spoon, the way people appear when they have been driving through something that should have stopped them and didn't, when the destination was more important than the conditions. He was broad-shouldered and gray at the temples, and he had the weathered, capable look of a man who worked outdoors and trusted his hands. He stood in the doorway and scanned the room with the specific focus of someone searching for one face and unable to see anything else until they find it. He found her. Margaret was at the corner booth. She was talking to Deb, who had long since finished her shift and stayed anyway, and she didn't see him immediately because her back was partially to the door, and she had learned today that people arrived unexpectedly, and so she had stopped watching for them. Deb saw him first. Her expression changed. Margaret noticed Deb's expression change and turned. The moment Daniel Marsh saw her face fully, he stopped walking. He was halfway across the diner, and he simply stopped the way you stop when the thing you have been moving toward finally becomes real, and the reality of it briefly overrides the mechanics of motion. He was 7 years old in a coat room in 1977. He was 55 now, and he had a contracting business and 3 daughters and a dog named Buck, and a life that was full and good and built on ground that he had never, not once in his adult life, taken entirely for granted, because at 7 years old, he had learned in 4 compressed and violent minutes exactly how quickly ground disappears. Margaret, he said. She stood up. She was steady. She had been steady all day. But when she stood and looked at the man who had been the boy she had gone back for the boy the ceiling had taken from her hands, the boy she had spent 47 years believing she had failed. Something in the steadiness developed a single crack, small and clean, like the first fracture in ice before it gives. He crossed the remaining distance. He took both her hands in his. He was a big man, and her hands disappeared inside his the way a child's hands disappear inside a grandfather's. And he looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment that the entire diner held its breath through. I looked for you, he said. His voice was rough, not from emotion suppressed, from emotion fully present and occupying the full space of his chest. I looked twice. I couldn't find you. I know, she said. I know. I didn't make it easy to be found. Why, he said, not accusatory, genuinely asking the way you ask someone a question whose answer you have been carrying for decades without filling in. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said the truest thing she had said all day, which was saying something, because the entire day had been one truth after another, stripped of every layer she had spent years wrapping around them. Because I thought I failed you, she said. I thought if I found you, if I tried, I would find out for certain that you were gone and I couldn't. She stopped, started again. The not knowing was the only version I could survive. He shook his head, slowly, back and forth. No, he said. No, I was there. I was at St. Mary's in Cheyenne. I was all right. He stopped. His jaw worked. I was asking for you. I asked the nurses. I asked my parents. I asked everyone who was the woman, what was her name. I want to say thank you. And they said, his voice dropped. They said they didn't know who I meant. Margaret closed her eyes. They erased you, he said. Even then, they were already erasing you. Reaper, watching from across the room, felt the anger come back. Not the controlled, purposeful anger from this afternoon, but something raw, briefly unmanageable. The anger of understanding in a new and more concrete way the magnitude of what had been deliberately stolen. Not just from Margaret, from this man too. From the conversation they should have had 30 years ago. From the thank you he had been carrying and never been allowed to deliver. Daniel Marsh was still holding Margaret's hands. I'm here now, he said. I'm here. She opened her eyes. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who has put down something very heavy and has not yet fully registered the absence of the weight. You have daughters, she said. He blinked, then almost smiled. 3. What are their names? He told her. She listened to each name with the particular attention she gave everything complete, unhurried, as if each name were something worth filing carefully. Good names, she said. He laughed. The same broken, relieved laugh that Ghost had produced earlier in the day. The laugh that lives at the exact boundary between grief and release and comes out sounding like both at once. Deb was openly crying. She had given up on any other mode of operation approximately 4 hours ago. Ghost put his hand on his own chest and pressed once, as if checking that the structural integrity was still there. Hitch looked at the ceiling. The ceiling of the hollow spoon had absorbed more significant emotional weight today than it had in 50 years of operation. Reaper picked up his coffee, drank it, set it down, said nothing. There was nothing to say. Some moments have everything they need. They sat Daniel Marsh down at the booth, and Deb brought him coffee and food because he had driven 90 miles through the back end of a blizzard and hadn't eaten since morning. He ate with one hand and kept the other on the table close to Margaret's, not touching, but near the way you keep a hand near something you are not quite ready to stop being sure is real. They talked for an hour, all of them around the table, Margaret and Daniel and Ghost and Reaper and Deb and Susan Holloway, the surgeon who still hadn't left, and Major Park, who had also not left, and a handful of others who had arrived through the afternoon and settled into the gravity of the place and couldn't find a reason to go. The conversation moved the way conversations move when the pressure of an entire day's emotion finally finds a container big enough in all directions at once, back and forward grief and laughter overlapping the rhythm of it, organic and unself-conscious. At 9:15, Reaper's phone buzzed. He looked at it, stood up, went to Ghost and said quietly, her sister's flight lands in Casper at 8 tomorrow morning. She's renting a car. Ghost looked at him. You didn't tell her? I told her she was coming, Reaper said. I didn't tell her when. She's going to want to go home tonight, Ghost said. Her cat, Dagger's at the trailer, Reaper said. I told him to stay. Ghost stared at him. You told Dagger, the newest patch, to spend the night in an old woman's trailer babysitting her cat. He volunteered, Reaper said. Ghost looked down the counter to where Dagger had been sitting earlier. His stool was empty. He had left for the trailer 2 hours ago. Ghost looked back at Reaper with an expression that contained in approximately equal parts disbelief and profound respect. He sent a picture, Reaper said. He showed Ghost his phone. On the screen was a photograph of Dagger, 26 years old. 6'2" leather-cut arms like structural beams, sitting on a sagging couch with a gray cat with one white ear arranged across his lap like he owned it. Dagger's face had the expression of a man who is trying very hard to look like this is not the best thing that has happened to him in recent memory. Ghost looked at the photograph for a long moment. Winston picked him, Ghost said. Apparently, Reaper said. Cats know, Ghost said. Don't tell Hitch that. He'll want a cat. They went back to the table. Margaret stayed until 10 o'clock. Daniel Marsh drove her home in his truck. Margaret having agreed to this only after establishing that it was practical and not charitable soil, a distinction she maintained with the consistency of a constitutional principle. She said her goodnights with the slightly formal warmth of a woman who had never been entirely comfortable with goodbyes, but was learning today of all days to try. She shook Reaper's hand, both of hers around one of his the way she had taken the phone earlier. She looked at him directly. You didn't have to do any of this, she said. No, he agreed. And why did you? He had answered this question once today, standing in a blizzard with 12 degrees and no good reason to be standing in it. The answer had been about her dignity, her refusal to beg the things she had shown him when she walked back out into the cold without asking anyone for anything. But that was the beginning of the day, and this was the end of it, and the answer had become something larger. Because some debts belong to all of us, he said. We all let you disappear. Every one of us. The whole country. We owe you more than soup. She held his hand for a moment longer. The soup was enough, she said. Daeblam. She gestured with one small motion at everything around them. The room, the people, the day, the impossible accumulation of it. This is more than I knew how to ask for. You didn't ask, he said. That's the whole problem. You never asked. She almost smiled. I'm learning. She shook Ghost's hand, and Ghost, to his own visible surprise, pulled her into a brief and careful hug, and she patted his back twice with the brisk affection of a woman who has decided this is acceptable and is not going to make a production of it. And Ghost, when he stepped back, had to look away for a second. She hugged Deb last and longer, and Deb said into her shoulder, I'm coming to check on you next week. I'm just telling you now so you can't say no. I wouldn't dream of it, Margaret said. Then she was gone. Daniel Marsh's truck pulled out of the parking lot, and the red taillights disappeared around the corner on Route 12, and the people who watched them go stood in the doorway for a moment in the cold air, letting the day settle. The night passed and the morning came, the way mornings come after significant days, quieter, grayer. The world returned to its ordinary dimensions, but permanently altered in the way of a room after furniture has been rearranged. You know where everything was. You also know where it is now. Reaper and his crew stayed at a motel 2 miles from the diner. Nobody had said anything about this being the plan. It simply was the way certain things simply are when the people involved are operating from the same understanding without needing to put it into words. At 7:30 in the morning, Reaper's phone rang. It was Ghost who was in the room next door. She knows, Ghost said. How? Ryan's article. The trust fund is embedded in it. She reads the news on her phone every morning. She told Deb that yesterday. She saw the fund. She saw the amount. A pause. She called Deb. What did she say? Deb said she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, this is too much. And Deb said, no, it isn't. And Margaret said, people have their own problems. And Deb said, people chose to do this, Margaret. You have to let people choose. Reaper was quiet for a moment. What did she say to that? He said. She cried, Ghost said. First time all day. First time, and Deb said she sounded like someone who hadn't cried in a very long time and didn't quite know how anymore. Reaper put his hand over his eyes, pressed briefly, took it away. Her sister lands in 45 minutes, he said. I know, Ghost said. We should get moving. They got moving. Evelyn Castallo was 76 years old, and she was small like her sister. But she moved faster with the particular energy of a woman who has been sitting on a plane for 2 hours running through everything she wanted to say and is now executing the plan of getting to where she needs to be as quickly as the laws of physics allow. She came out of the rental car at Margaret's trailer at 9:45 in the morning, and Margaret was standing on the front step. Dagger had called ahead, had apparently been texting Reaper from the trailer with the focused devotion of a military scout providing position updates, and the two women looked at each other across the distance of 47 years in a cracked concrete path, and one white-eared cat sitting on the step beside Margaret's feet. Evelyn walked faster. Margaret stepped down. They met in the middle. Nobody watched this closely. Not Reaper, not Ghost, not Dagger, who was standing at the side of the trailer trying to look like he was doing something else. Some moments require witnesses but not observers. They require people who are present and who then have the decency to look somewhere slightly to the side and let the moment be what it is without adding the weight of being watched. What could be heard from a respectful distance was this Evelyn's voice saying her sister's name. Once the way you say a word you have been silently repeating for 47 years and have only now been given permission to say aloud. And Margaret's voice saying something back that nobody caught because it was spoken directly into her sister's shoulder and meant for no one else. They stayed like that for a long time. Winston wound around both sets of feet and then sat down and began grooming himself with the serene indifference of a cat who has decided this situation is under control and his involvement is no longer required. Dagger looked at the cat. The cat looked at Dagger. Something passed between them that was its own kind of communication. The ceremony was not Margaret's idea. She said so clearly and repeatedly to Reaper, and to Deb and to Ryan Shea, who had by this point become a permanent fixture in her orbit, and who was covering the story with the sustained, careful attention of a journalist who understands that the story he is in is the story of his career and possibly of his life. "I don't need a ceremony," she said. "This is too much. All of this is already too much." "It's not for you," Deb told her. "That's what you keep missing. It's for them, the people who were there, the people who drove through the storm, the people who carried your picture to war. It's for them to have somewhere to put what they feel." Margaret looked at her. "That's a very sophisticated argument." "I've been practicing it for 2 days," Deb said. The ceremony was held on the following Saturday. The Granger's Hollow Town Square, which was not much of a square, being more of an intersection with ambitions, was packed in a way it had not been packed since the town's centennial in 1994, and the temperature was still well below freezing, and nobody left. Fire trucks lined the street. 3 ladder companies from Granger's Hollow and 2 neighboring towns, their crews standing at attention in full gear. Former students stood in rows holding candles that the wind kept requiring them to relight. Teachers and nurses, and one retired judge named Patricia Ghost's mother, who had driven from Casper and stood near the front with her son's arm around her shoulders and her eyes bright and fixed on the small, white-haired woman at the center of everything. Reaper had not planned to speak. He was there as escort. The chapter had ridden in formation through the streets of Granger's Hollow that morning, 8 motorcycles slow and deliberate, flanking Daniel Marsh's truck, which carried Margaret through streets lined with people who had come out in the cold to stand and watch her pass. He was there as witness. He had not planned to speak. The mayor spoke. A state senator who had driven from Cheyenne spoke. A former student who had become a firefighter, who pointed at Margaret from the podium and said with simple directness, "Everything I am started with, you getting me out of that building," spoke Patricia Howland. Now Patricia Mercer spoke and could not finish, and Ghost finished for her, reading the last paragraph from the paper she handed him while she stood beside him with her hand over her heart. Then someone in the crowd, Reaper never found out who started chanting his name. Not Reaper. Cole. Cole. Cole, Cole. Quiet at first, then wider until it had spread through enough of the crowd that there was no reasonable way to pretend he hadn't heard it. He went to the podium. He stood there for a moment. He was not a man who performed in public. He was not a man who had nice things to say about institutions or ceremonies or the kind of organized collective sentiment that turned a private truth into a public event. He had spent 62 years being precisely and deliberately the thing that the kind of people who organized ceremonies like this one crossed to the other side of the street to avoid. He looked at Margaret. She was sitting in a chair at the front between Evelyn and Daniel Marsh, with Susan Holloway on one side and Ghost on the other, and Patricia Mercer's hand resting on her shoulder from behind. She looked small and warm and more entirely herself than she had looked at any point since he had followed her into a blizzard 6 days ago. He looked back at the crowd. He cleared his throat. "I'm not going to just stand up here and tell you what Margaret Vale did," he said. "You know what she did. You drove through a storm to know it. You carried it to war. You built your careers on top of it." He stopped. "What I'm going to tell you is what happened 6 days ago in this town. An 89-year-old woman walked into a diner with $1.04 and asked if it was enough to buy soup. And the first answer she got was no." He let that sit. "That's what we did with her. That's how we treated the 47 years after the fire. We gave her $1.04 worth of attention, and then we moved on." The square was silent, not the polite silence of a public gathering, the held, uncomfortable silence of people recognizing something true about themselves. "People think monsters look like bikers," Reaper said. He said it flat and without self-pity, as a statement of social fact. "I know what people think when they see a man like me. I've known it for 40 years. What I learned this week is that the real monsters are quieter than that. They wear suits and they sit in county offices and they sign documents that bury a woman alive, and then they go home and they sleep fine." He paused. "The real monsters are the ones who forget their heroes. Not dramatically, just slowly, over time, because something else was more convenient to pay attention to." He looked at Margaret. We didn't deserve you, he said. I think you know that. I think that's been part of the problem. But you're here, and we're here. And whatever we do next is going to be the measure of whether we learned anything or whether we're going to make you prove it again. He stepped back from the podium. Don't make her prove it again. The square was still. Then it wasn't. Then it was the kind of sound a crowd makes when something has landed in the specific place inside them where they keep the things they actually believe. Margaret stood up from her chair. She hadn't planned to. Her body made the decision before her mind confirmed it. She stood up and she turned toward Reaper, who was stepping away from the podium, and she took 3 steps toward him and she put her hand on his arm. He stopped. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. She said, "Thank you." Just that. 2 words. But she said them with her whole self, with every year of the 89, with the fire and the coins and the cat and the sister and the boy who became a man, and the daughter she had saved who became a surgeon who saved thousands more. She said it with everything, and he received it the same way, and neither of them needed anything else said. That night, after the crowd had gone and the fire trucks had left and the candles had burned down, the Hollow Spoon opened its doors for what Gerald Fitch announced in a handwritten sign taped to the front window would be a permanent monthly event, free dinner, first Thursday of every month for any senior in Granger's Hollow who needed it. Margaret was the first one through the door. She sat at the corner booth, the same one. Evelyn sat across from her. Daniel Marsh pulled up a chair from an adjacent table. Ghost sat on one side. Dagger, who had somehow ended up at the center of this entire situation, despite being the newest member of the chapter, and possibly the most confused person in Wyoming, sat on the other. Reaper took the booth beside them, not at the table, beside it. The way a person sits who is part of something without needing to be at the center of it. Deb came over. She stood at the edge of the booth with her order pad. She looked at Margaret. "What can I get you?" she said. Margaret looked at the menu. She looked at Deb. She looked around the table at her sister, at the man who had been the boy, at the young men who had appointed themselves her protectors, at the room full of people eating warm food in a Wyoming winter. Then she looked back at Deb, and she said with the full and unhurried ease of a woman who has finally, after a very long time, arrived somewhere she is allowed to stay, "Tomato bisque," she said. "A full bowl this time." Deb smiled through whatever she was feeling and wrote it down. "How much do I owe you, sweetheart?" Margaret asked. Deb looked up. Her eyes were bright. Her voice was steady. She said the truest thing anyone in the Hollow Spoon had said all the week, which was saying something. Because the week had been full of true things. "Not this time, Margaret," she said. "Not ever again." And that was the moment, not the ceremonies, not the speech, not the phone call or the document or the reunion, that Margaret Vale, 89 years old hero, forgotten woman, owner of one gray cat with a white ear, finally let herself believe that she had come home. She had walked in with $1.04. She left with everything that had always been hers.